always come back and do it again later. Just a point of note, there's not going to be a class next Monday, so I've got a business obligation I can't get out of, so I will not be here next Monday. We'll be doing the next test online as a result of that, so we won't lose any lecture time, but we will lose a day that we would normally be in here just taking a test. So I feel like the online tests are a little bit easier for you guys. You get to have a chance to do it as an open book. And the time frame is a little bit more open-ended, so I feel like I can't imagine that anybody really has any complaints about that idea.
Works for me.
All right, so
no, I have the study guides up there.
Okay. Adam's at it again. He's what a good guy.
Thank you, executive.
So let me just mark people in. Okay. Courtney, was here. I'm assuming she's going to be back. Liz is here. Austin's here. And Joseph is here. He's not here. Oh, there you are. You are here. You are here.
And I was like, what?
You are here. Okay.
I was confused, like, I'm here.
Not seeing Pete. Okay. Pete, not here. Okay. All right, so I believe we left off at Russian Constructivism. Is that correct?
Sounds about right.
Does that sound right? Yeah. So we have one more ism that we need to cover, and then we're going to dive into style. And we're going to start to look at the difference between style and isms, and talk about a couple of the styles. And then next Monday, I should be ready to talk to you guys about the Bauhaus. So Bauhaus is really an important facility, and what happens to them is really fundamental to the way the design shifts over the course of time. So here we go. Sage, would you mind hitting the first light on the left side? That one. Oh, maybe that one's the one we keep on. Sorry. Keep that one on, turn the other one off. The one on the right side. There we go. Excellent. Good. So the last style that we want to talk about, what we've been talking about, are styles that are essentially non-representational or very abstract. And I have to point out that the style actually is a representative art. It just doesn't look like it's representative. It's very, very abstract in the way that it's formulated, and a lot of people get very confused by it. But we have to know that it really came from ideas, from real things. As far as the ism that's attached to it, this ism is actually called neoplasticism. We also call it the style, which means the style, and it comes from the Netherlands. And the two guys were really in charge of this new ism that came about. The first one's name was Piet Mondrian, and this is an example of Piet Mondrian's early work. This is not the style. I just want to point out, this is not the style. This is Piet Mondrian's early work from 1905. The style didn't really come around until about 1917, so this is about 15 years before he was painting in the style movement. He had a background in post-impressionism. You see very representational images of the Dutch Netherlands, the countryside, and he became very, very fascinated with the idea of cubism. And so from this, he morphed into cubist paintings, and we can see this cubist painting, and then he eventually turned that cubist painting into more abstract versions of cubism, so that we really become very, very abstracted. Ultimately, all of that cubist practice and the understanding of cubism led to the style, which looks like this. And I'm sure you guys have seen this style before without really understanding what it means. Yes.
So I had a rug that's exactly a copy of that. It was like a shag, not a shag rug, but like a carpet. That was an exact copy of that.
Are
in
you
school. My college.
sure?
Yeah.
It was the exact same one.
No, yeah, I'm definite. Yeah.
Because here's another one. And
No,
here's
there's one with the
another
L
one.
in it.
Here's
No,
another one.
I'm sure. I swear it's the first one.
Because they named these paintings, these compositions, Composition 2 in red, blue, and yellow, and they were all very similarly named to each other, so it could be Composition number 10 in red, blue, and yellow. And we would find those same elements in it. They purposely chose to name them in these kind of weird names, these abstract names, because they didn't want to give away what it was that they were seeing. And the point is that these guys were really actually painting real things. So this could be a vase of flowers or a scene outside a window or a portrait. We'll never know because it's up to the beholder to try to figure out. The thing that Piet Mondrian and Theo van Doesburg were doing were they were taking the idea of cubism, of breaking things down into simple geometric form, and trying to go a step further than that. So in Cubism, we recognize things as squares, circles, triangles, the basic components of shapes. In Neoplasticism or De Stijl, they just eliminated circles and triangles from that equation too, turned everything into squares or rectangles. Because the goal with Neoplasticism or De Stijl was to get down to the most fundamental basics. So when we analyze colors, what are the basic colors that we look at? What do we call primaries?
Red, blue, and yellow.
Red, blue, and yellow. And from red, blue, and yellow, and black and white, we can start to mix those colors together to create any color in the spectrum. That's what these guys were doing. So instead of focusing on a purple flower, the artist here, Piet Mondrian, let's just pretend that this is a bowl of flowers, that this is a painting of a bowl of flowers, and that it's a bowl of purple flowers on a gray table with a blue chair sitting next to it, okay? And there's a ray of light coming in through the window. That's what we're seeing as artists. Piet Mondrian chose to eliminate all of the non-essential things, broke the part of the flowers down into the color that he felt was better to purple, between blue and purple, and he chose red. So red became the dominant color in that portion of the painting. There is the blue that represents the chair, which might have actually been a green chair, we don't know, and the ray of light is pinpointed by this, and then the rest of it, it's like, okay, it's his composition, it's the way that he's seeing it. And so in every particular instance, they're always working with horizontals and verticals, so they're not even using diagonals, except for Theo van Doesburg. Theo van Doesburg likes diagonals, and this is really kind of the only way that you can tell the difference between Piet Mondrian's work and Theo van Doesburg. Theo van Doesburg would use the idea of diagonals, 45-degree angles, mind you, not 30, 45-degree angles, so very geometric. But that was the only real difference between what he was doing and what Piet Mondrian was doing. So, and again, we have composition number 22 as the name of this. The color palette that they would use, black, white, and red, or black, white, red, yellow, blue, and sometimes gray. Yes.
Do you think maybe the composition number has anything to do with the date? Because they're both 22. Just coincidence.
Just a coincidence, yeah. This could have been 23 or 29 or whatever, so I don't think it had anything to do with the year. As we move along, as these guys started to evolve, they realized that people were getting really confused about their work and they wanted somehow to indicate what this stuff was, and so they started to give away in the titles, name their stuff a little bit less ambiguous. So this one became Victory Boogie Woogie, which doesn't really tell us what it is, but we can kind of get the idea of maybe it has something to do with jazz, maybe it has something to do with dancing, maybe it has something to do with celebration, who knows. But at least we can start to form pictures in our head as to what this could conceivably be. A lot of people, though, look at this and try not to form pictures, they're just intrigued by the shapes. And that's really what the Neoplasticism was about. It was trying to eliminate any kind of gestures of emotion in the paintings or the works whatsoever, and to break it down to a simplified form. So if you remember what Constructivism was and what Suprematism was, they are looking for emotion through those shapes. These guys are eliminating shapes, any kind of emotion attached to shapes, and just trying to pare things down to the most simplistic, neutral forms that they possibly can. And for that reason, De Stijl artists consider themselves to be apolitical. This is one of the few art movements that we have that is not associated with any kind of political agenda. So they weren't pushing for communism, they weren't pushing for socialism or fascism or any of that stuff. They weren't saying destroy the world, they were saying break things down into its most primary, simplistic form possible. Now, to understand how they came about these compositions, Piet Mondrian and Theo van Doesburg both played with this a little bit to try to explain to people. So here's Piet Mondrian's explanation of how De Stijl works. We start out with a painting by Cezanne called The Card Players, and Piet Mondrian has done us the favor of taking that image and recreating it into a cubist kind of organization, and then from there he came up with this, and this is the De Stijl version of that. Very complex, and it doesn't really look anything like the Card Players to me, but that's what he says it's supposed to be, so I'll believe him. Theo van Doesburg did it too, and so here's his take on how this breaks down. So here we have his image of a sketch of a cow, and then here's his cubist image of a cow. We can still see kind of cow in this, and then this is how it looks as a De Stijl painting. And again, like, all right, I guess so, if you say so, that is a cow. I wouldn't necessarily see it, but okay, that's his interpretation. Regardless of this style was very popular for a lot of people because it was very intellectual, and it was also minimal, and it also was apolitical. So a lot of the folks that were associated with the Bauhaus, which we're going to talk about next week, the Bauhaus purposely chose De Stijl as one of the areas that they really like to focus on because it was so neutral in the way that it represented itself. The Theo van Doesburg was especially prominent among those people that were hanging out at the Bauhaus in this time. He, because they were all about simplicity and paring things out and minimalizing things, when they chose to do things with typography, they chose to use a sans serif typeface because sans serif doesn't have the embellishment of the flares on the bottom points of the characters. And the color palette is very similar to the constructivist color palette, except that in a lot of the De Stijl's things, they'll add blue and yellow into it too. And that's really the telltale traits of De Stijl. This chair was designed by an architect named Gerrit Rietveld, and actually it's very comfortable, despite the fact that it looks very, very stiff. But what we see again and again when we're looking at De Stijl is this very rigid format, this idea of the simplicity of the color palettes and the rigidness of the design. And so over and over again we see this kind of hard structure that is part of De Stijl elements. Gerrit Rietveld actually designed houses for people in this De Stijl methodology, and I point out that this is 1924 when this house was built. It would be, would fit into today's landscape, but even still it would be considered very contemporary by many people. The children that lived in this house were horribly ridiculed by friends because the house was so weird by 1924 standards. The interior of the space showed a lot of really forward thinking as far as industrial design and interior design, so open concept kind of living very much at work in this environment, to the point that the walls were actually movable. So you can see at the ceiling line and at the floor line, you can see particular tracks where the walls can collapse in or they can pull back out again, so you can actually build rooms into the space. And in the corners of the house, they actually had the windows coming to a corner point rather than having a baluster that goes straight up and down to divide the windows. So that was really unique and interesting. The radiators were using industrial style radiators instead of radiators that were more of the era. I love this because we have this kind of old-fashioned little fireplace over here in the corner in comparison to everything else that's very modern and contemporary. So it kind of gives you a clue as to what the interiors were, how the time was, how we see the difference between the time of what was available to them at the time. I'm sure if Garrett Wrightfield had the opportunity, he would have designed that furnace or that heating system as well. Regardless, Theo van Doesburg also played with the idea of architecture and building things, and he designed the interior space for this restaurant, and here's the staircase that he built. And so this idea of the rigidity and this hard formatted horizontal and vertical fit very nicely into this, and this will have an influence when we start to look into some of the more modern designs and minimal designs that start to get picked up as we move past this 1920s, 1930s period. So here are the traits of the style, or neoplasticism, and the two people that I want you to know that are associated with it are Piet Mondrian and Theo van Doesburg. They were very strongly influenced by Cubism, and what they were really trying to talk about was the mathematical structure of the universe and the universal harmony of mathematics and nature. So if anybody's ever noticed that the number 5 has relationship to nature, or the square root of 1 has a relationship to various aspects of nature or in design. Came from these guys. These guys were really paying attention to that. All curved lines were completely eliminated. Sans serif typefaces were favored. Primary colors were used, plus black, white, and gray, and that was it as far as the color palette goes. And the angles were always 90-degree horizontal and verticals only. Sometimes Theo van Doesburg used 45 degrees, but even then he butted those two at 90-degree angles. Okay. So, I can come back to this at the end of the class if you like. I like to show this as a contrast to what we've been studying, to look at all of these. And you'll notice here that this is a chart that's showing how the relationship of all of these isms are related to each other. And if you follow from the top, you can see that we've got Japanese prints at the very top, we've got Neo-Impressionism, and we've got Cubism. All of that kind of leads to Cubism, and if we look at where Cubism is, we can see all of the lines are connected to Cubism, to machine aesthetics, to suprematism, to constructivism, to abstract art. In general, we can see that they're all related to each other. And that's going to be important as we move forward. I have another chart that I'd like to show you, but I also want to point out that this is cover for an exhibit that happened at the Museum of Modern Art in New York in 1935. And I believe I told you guys about the Armory Show. Did I tell you guys about the Armory Show? The Armory Show.
Vaguely, I don't remember much.
So the Armory Show, I said Teddy Roosevelt called the artists of the futurists and the Cubist style, he called them the lunatic fringe. And that was because the Americans just considered the stuff that these Europeans were doing was just crazy. And they felt that the style of Cubism, Futurism, De Stijl, Dadaism, all of that stuff was not really happening until we get to the 1920s, until we get past World War I. And then after World War I, then America starts to catch on to this stuff. But prior to that time, Americans just panned this show that came through the United States. It was called the Armory Show, and started in New York, traveled to Boston, went to Chicago, went to a few other cities beyond that, and every place that showed up, it was panned by the critics. They thought that was a horrible show. Now, by 1935, the Museum of Modern Art in New York is having a show about all of these different isms, which tells us that the United States is finally caught up. By 1935, the United States is finally caught up. I like this graph a little bit better to explain all of those isms and how they're related to each other. It's the same thing as what we saw over here, but now this is just done in a little bit more simplistic manner. So everything ultimately is a reaction to the Victorian era and the Industrial Revolution, and we can see that all the things that we've talked about, Art Nouveau, arts and crafts, Peter Behrens, the Vienna Secession, the Glasgow School, Vienna Workshop, the Symbolist movement, and then Cubism, and all of the different isms that we're tied to, they're all related to each other because everything here plays into this thing that we're going to call the Bauhaus. And again, we're going to talk about the Bauhaus more next week. I'm kind of jumping ahead and showing this, but I also like this little timeline to show here to show you where we've been, what we've been looking at so far. So what we saw from 1900 to about 1920 were a lot of changes in the world. We saw changes in human rights, we saw technology, science, world politics, fashion, transportation, social mores, photography, especially as a means of capturing things previously unknown, like microscopic images, or what Alaska looks like, what the North Pole looks like, exploration, all of these things, communications, all of these things are happening in these first 20 years of the 1900s. 1900 to 1920. At the same time that all of that is happening, we have this big effect called the isms that happen. And so it's not a surprise that all of those changes and technological changes are being reflected in the isms, in the art styles that we see happening. And then at the very tippy top, we see 1914 to 1918 was the era. It was the years when World War I were happening, and immediately after it, we had the Treaty of Versailles, 1919. And we'll notice that what happens right after World War I, that Treaty of Versailles, is the rise in Nazism and Hitler. And we also notice that we have this crossover here in the isms of Art Deco and the Bauhaus. Today we're going to talk about Art Deco. Again, we're going to talk about the Bauhaus. But we also have to take note that Depression happened in there, and what Hitler happened at the same time, that the Bauhaus died at the same time that Hitler rose to full power. And that's not a coincidence. There's a relationship to all of that stuff that's happening at the top and what happens to the Bauhaus. Today, again, we're going to talk about Art Deco and this thing that we call style. We're going to talk about something that's called object style posters, and I want to point out that what we're talking about now is not an art movement. So the other day we were talking about this, and we said anything with the letters ISM, the suffix ISM onto a word, turns it into a cause, or turns it into something that's got great meaning. So can somebody think of a word that has an ism at the end of it?
Communism.
Communism is one. So the idea of communal living taken on a grand scale, right? What else? Ism.
Fascism.
Fascism, yep. So becoming dictator in a dictator-run country. What else? Just go.
Capitalism?
Capitalism, so the idea of commerce, but done at a grand scale. So the entire economy is based on a capitalist society. Anybody else? Ism? Liberalism, progressivism. Yeah, so we can pretty much take any word and add an ism to the end of it, and it becomes something that's bigger than itself. Sheila-ism. So you choose. But in any case, the thing that we're going to study here, so we want to make sure that we understand. So what we're looking at now is no longer an ism, that we're taking aspects of isms and we're applying them into something new. We're calling it a style. A style. So up until this point, we haven't really talked about post-impressionism, ism, there again, or impressionism or anything like that, really affecting Art Nouveau. Art Nouveau is really a style. Arts and crafts were really a style. And now we're getting into other commercial aspects that are a style, meaning that they're picking up on traits of the high arts, of the fine arts, but they're not necessarily applying them in the same way. The first one that we want to talk about are object style posters. And there are three words that we use to describe object style posters. I don't have them here, but we can call them Sachs plackets, spelled S-A-C-H plackets, That's a German word, Sack, Placket. We can call them object style, or we can call them Placket style. Placket means poster. So Placket style is poster style, object style, or Sack Placket. So I'll try to write those here. S-A-C-H-P-L-A-K-A-T, Sack Placket, Placket style, and object style that we see here. They all mean the exact same thing. Exact same thing. So the words are interchangeable. Anyhow, I bring this up, and I'm going to switch to this image right there, which is nothing, right? Well, the reason I have nothing there is because I want to tell the story of the guy who created this idea called Sack Placket, or object style. His name was Lucien Bernard. Don't worry, I'll show you his name in a minute. But he was a young artist. He was only 18 when he left home, and he left home over a dispute that he had with his father. He was really gung-ho on Art Nouveau. He had seen exhibits of Art Nouveau, thought that it was the coolest thing since sliced bread. He just thought it was way, way cool. This is around 1904, 1905 that he saw exhibits of Art Nouveau. And while his parents were away, supposedly, he repainted his parents' house in an Art Nouveau style. His dad was not very appreciative, and so they got into a fight, and he left home. Who knows if that's really the story? Lucien Bernard had a tendency to over-exaggerate stories a lot or retell them differently every single time. In any case, he ended up moving to Berlin at the age of 18, and he decided that he was going to make a living as a poet. I don't know about you, but I don't know too many gainfully employed poets. And even today, but in that time, maybe there were a few, but I don't know. I can't really imagine that was a big calling for the world of whatever. So he was pretty much hungry. He was starving. He was making a living as a messenger, and somewhere along the line he came across a poster that was advertising a contest for a company called Priester. They make matches. And Lucien Bernard, thinking, oh, here's my chance to show my artistic talent, decided to enter this contest. So he started out with a set of matches and the word Priester that he put onto this page. And then, knowing that he really enjoyed Art Nouveau, he started to add all of those things that we have in Art Nouveau. So, women with spaghetti-like hair. He had dancing women in the background. And then he had a cigar with, again, that kind of whiplashy smoke that was rising up from it and circling the word Priester. And a tablecloth that was covered with the checkerboard pattern. And just had all of these things that were, to him, said something about Art Nouveau. And he started to show it to friends, and friends said, great ad for a cigar. No. So he got rid of the cigar. And then others said, oh, great ad for a club, with the dancing women in the background. No. And then he, got rid of that, and then he was down to the tablecloth, and somebody said, oh, great ad for a restaurant. No. And so by the time he was done with this, he had scrapped every idea that he had, and he was out of time. He had to enter this contest. So at the last minute, he got rid of everything, went back to the original thing that he had, which is just a basic square with the word Priester and a set of matches in it. Sent it off to the judges thinking there's no chance that he's going to win. This does not look like Art Nouveau, which is so cool and hot these days. But all the same, he sent this in, and the judges reacted the same way that he thought they were. They threw it in the trash. They didn't like it, except for one judge. His name was Ernst Grunewald. You don't need to know that, but he worked for a company called Hollerbaum and Schmidt. That you do need to know about, Hollerbaum and Schmidt. And he ended up pulling that poster out of the trash can and then continued to convince the other judges that reason why they needed to accept this particular poster as the winner for this contest. And he basically told them, or convinced them, that the simplicity of it was its beauty, that it was so pared down that there was no mistaking what the advertisement was about. And Ernst Grunewald liked it so much that even if Lucian Bernard had not won this contest, which he did, he was prepared to go ahead and offer him a contract to do more work with Hollerbaum and Schmidt, the company. And from that point forward, this style took off, and this became very endemic of the work of Lucian Bernard. The simplicity of the minimalism of this particular kind of poster. Simple background, the type tells us who the company is, and then we have an image of the product. And from that day forward, Hollerbaum and Schmidt hired Lucian Bernard to do all of their designs for client advertisements in the same fashion, over and over and over again. And they became incredibly successful, considering especially how fast society was moving. We've moved from a time where people were walking down the street and looking at Druco umbrella posters and going, where's the umbrella, to this, where there's absolutely no mistaking what the product is in the advertisements. And that's because people are moving faster. They don't have the luxury of walking by foot along past the signs. Now they're driving in a car, and if they don't get it in an instant what the ad is about, then it's not successful. This was successful because people could understand in an instant what the ad was about. They knew what the company name was, and it was a brilliant ploy for marketing. Ernst Growald and Hollerbaum and Schmidt ended up not only having Lucian Bernard as a designer working with them, so any advertisements that they had or clients that they got in that needed advertisement, they would give them Lucian Bernard, but they and the same thing with Lucian Bernard, any jobs that he took, he would send them immediately over to Hollerbaum and Schmidt, so they had this symbiotic kind of relationship. But Hollerbaum and Schmidt also hired a couple of other designers to follow in the same footsteps. So they hired a guy named Hans-Rudi Ehrt, who had his own particular take on this idea of sock pockets or object style. So even though this isn't, Opel is a name of an automobile manufacturer, even though we don't see the car in it, we see the chauffeur, and we get the idea that this is an expensive or an elite car that's driven by somebody that would wear this kind of costume in it. And they hired a guy named Julius Gipkins, who oftentimes would show more than just the chair, because this is what the company was about. It was a furniture company. So he would show lifestyle, again, in his. Or here's another one by Julius Gipkins where he's showing a little bit more of the idea of a futurist effect happening in the background. So these guys, Julius Gipkins, Hans-Rudi Ehrt, Julius Klinger was another one of them, and Hans-Rudi Ehrt, Julius Gipkins, Julius Klinger, and okay, that's four. I think I got four. Those four guys all worked for Hollerbaum and Schmidt. There was one other guy that was really, really popular for these sock pocket or pocket style or object style posters, and his name was Ludwig Hohlwein. He was the only one among them that was not hired by Hollerbaum and Schmidt. He had his own kind of following, his own popularity, and in his work he was capitalizing on that same technique that we saw in the beggar staffs. So if you recall, with the beggar staffs, they were creating things where the background kind of collided into the foreground image, and he was doing that here in the ads that he was creating, where he had the background melding into the foreground. His images were a little bit more complex, but they were also very simplistic in many regards. And so among the designers that were designing this pocket style effect, Ludwig Hohlwein actually was the most successful among them. This is probably one of my favorite ads that he did for a cigarette company. And so we can see the silhouette of the person, we can see the background, and then we can see just the glowing tip of that cigarette. So the traits that we would say that we see in sock pocket or object style are that kind of simplicity that's very reminiscent of Japanese influence. There's no background, or the background that emphasizes the product is the only thing that we see. The message is very blunt and to the point. The product really is the obvious hero in the designs here. And then if there's any secondary copy in the advertisements, like store location or whatever, it's greatly minimized. It's not really the most important part of the ads. So very, 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 very simple kind of advertising still used to this very day. So if you guys are hunting for your next observation, think about sock pockets, object style, because it's very much still in use today in advertising. Okay, I'm going to come back to that if you needed to. So I pointed out on that timeline that we had a world war that kind of entered into the stuff, and when we were talking about the isms, we pointed out that a lot of the isms arose prior to World War I. So we had Futurism, Cubism, and Dadaism. These were all reactions to World War I. So was Expressionism, or to the prelude to World War I. A lot of them died out after World War I. Expressionism started to die out after World War I. Dadaism started to die out, except for those couple of people that we pointed out that died out. Futurism died out after World War I. But the idea of the styles that were incorporated with them stayed. Now, in World War I, there were two sides to this fight. There were the Allied forces that we see here, represented by the United States, Great Britain, and France, and then there were others that were part of that alliance as well. And then there were the Central Powers, which is Germany, Austria, Hungary, and Russia. In any case, the styles that these guys chose to do were propaganda material is very different from each other. We're going to look at the Allied forces first. And we start with Great Britain. And Great Britain created this poster that was became very, very popular. It was popular in Great Britain at the time. And the name is not correct. I don't know. It's not the guy that did this. Do I have the wrong name here? Okay. Well, I can't remember what the name of that is. In any case, it's not really important who the designer of this poster was. What is important here is that the guy that's being portrayed here, his name is Lord Kitchener, and he was the Secretary of State for War in Great Britain. And everybody knew his face, they understood who he was. And the simplicity of this poster here tells us a lot. Is this a sock pocket style poster? This is object style. Think about it.
So it's a contrast now that there's no squares or there's no 45-degree angle.
No, that's just style.
Okay.
This is, I'm asking object style. The last one that we saw with
Okay.
Lucian Bernard was object style. Is this an object style poster? Anybody?
Yeah.
Based upon Julius Gipkins and Lucian Bernard and what we just saw. Okay, so you're confused, right?
Yeah, well, because to me, like, it gets to the point, and it's got like the big lettering and everything,
Mm-hmm.
but at the same time, well, and everyone realized who that was too. Like, so if they drove by, like you said, they would.
Mhm.
It's a vault, I guess, is maybe the best way to describe it.
Is this an object style poster?
Yeah.
Okay, so it is, but it's a different version than what we see of those posters that we see with Lucian Bernard and Julius Gipkins and Julius Klinger and Ludwig Holbein. The difference is, well, the things that make it similar, the plain white background, right? The simplicity of the message, just a few words, not really a whole lot of information that's going on here, so that's very simplistic. How it's different is the way that they're treating the image. So the image, if we go backwards and we look at these, notice how flat the image is. We've got flat color, flat color, flat color. We've got maybe 4 colors showing up in this entire image. And if we go to here, we've got the whole gradient scale, right, of all of these colors. So the Americans are applying this in a very different way. I'll point out the dates on this, 1917. Same time that the Armory Show had completed in the United States, and the Armory Show was widely panned. They did not like, the Americans did not like that flattened kind of style that those Europeans were doing. Anything progressive, they didn't like. So what we have here is, at this time, popularity-wise, Norman Rockwell was very popular. Does this remind you of Norman Rockwell kind of style?
Yeah, a little bit, yeah.
Yeah, so this is why this is popular in the United States. The only thing here that tells us that this is object style in any way, shape, or form is the flat background behind it. But otherwise, not really. And the United States and Great Britain, if we look at this one here, you'll notice that here, does this remind you of anything?
Oh, yeah, what do you call it? I forget it.
Wood type posters that remind you of, so if we look at the crazy letter forms here,
Oh, yeah.
reminds us of wood type posters. There was a reason that they did this, and that was because they were pushing for the idea of sentimentality. The idea in both of these posters, and this one came first, and then the Americans followed after with this picture of this Uncle Sam poster designed by James Montgomery Flagg, which, by the way, that's James Montgomery Flagg's self-portrait. So he used himself as a model for Uncle Sam here. But what we see is that what they're hearkening to is a message that's kind of sentimental. So they used a style that was very sentimental, that made them recall what it was like in the Victorian time, when things were simpler, when things were better. That was the good old days. Now we're in this time where we've got these Europeans that are just crazy and doing weird stuff. We don't want to have anything to do with that. We're going to do a poster that talks about the good old times. And so on and on. In the United States, they were doing posters like this, where we have, the worker marching side by side with the military guy and with the Navy guy, and they're together, we win, yay, and everybody's smiling. And we're talking about war here, but everybody is smiling. And we're less and less soft pocket or object style in this, because now we have background. We've got ships in the background and buildings going on behind us, and we've got a lot of typography going on here. And yeah, there's one big headline, but the image is certainly very, very elaborate, very traditional in style. So the United States had this tendency, especially in World War I, to go towards these more nostalgic, almost old-fashioned kind of posters that in some ways kind of spooked people, and they made war look like it was actually something kind of fun. So here we have a girl that's dressed up in a boy's outfit and saying, gee, I wish I were a man, I'd join the Navy, which kind of is emasculating, shaming guys into thinking that they have to join be a man and it says there, be a man and do it, United States Navy recruiting station, and shaming them into signing up for the military. Or taking the enemy and putting him into a can, or making him look like he's kind of silly and canned up, and what you can do as part of the war effort, build victory gardens and all of that stuff. So this was the kind of attitude that American propaganda posters had. Central powers, Germany, the Ottomans, Hungary, Austria, their posters looked like this. And we can see a really big difference when we do a side-by-side comparison in this way to what the Germans were doing for their propaganda during World War I versus the United States. Now the image is not of men, hanging off of each other side by side, all grinning and looking happy about going to war. Now we have this kind of demonic image, and it's kind of scary. That serpent that's climbing through the letter 8, and this is the number 8 represents the 8th war loan that this is being made available. This is basically the enemy, the United States, Great Britain, France. That's what that is supposed to represent, that snake that's climbing through. So it's scary. And over again, their images are of scary scenes. That white dove that's in the foreground represents Germany and the future of Germany, but we can see that the background has got this dark image of a ship being sunk, and it's black, and it's scary looking. And part of the reason for this was because for Germany, the war was on their doorstep. The United States, we didn't have that happening. It was way over there. So the United States had a happier kind of attitude about the war, whereas in Germany, their images were much darker. But you can notice that they're definitely taking advantage of this idea of pocket style or object style posters in the way that they're defining them. Even though the copy starts to get a little bit intense, it still is very simplistic, at least as the graphic aspects of it. You'll notice also that change of the typography that's happening here. Let's go backwards to this one.
Like Old English or something, or like?
It's, so, does this remind us of anything, this type? You said Old English. Does it remind you of that type that Gutenberg had developed way back when? Guess what nationality Gutenberg was?
German.
German. This is how the Germans were responding to their own idea of nostalgia, by pulling out typography that was reminiscent of their history. So this font, this idea of this calligraphic type of lettering was used a lot in their stuff. Even when John Hartfeld was doing some of his designs, which I showed you some of his stuff, he was poking fun at the Germans for choosing this kind of typography. And here's another one. So they either chose this kind of long, spindly, Gothic kind of textural letter forms, or they chose sans serif. It was either one or the other. And the reason they chose this is because this was progressive. This was progressive, and the other font was very nostalgic. And so they were trying to pull the audience in either one of two directions. But either way, the messaging was not really as clear as what it was in the American version posters. They were a lot more metaphorical, a lot more symbolic in the way that they were created. Still, we have some really beautiful posters, like this one designed by Lily Colvine, that really kind of, again, pare down and simplify the idea of, you know, even if you're injured, you can still be a worker in the factories. So they're trying to appeal to people to, again, become involved in the war in whatever way they possibly could. Any questions about German propaganda posters? So after we got through World War II, then we started to see a new style evolve, and we call this style Art Deco. Art Deco is not, again, not a design movement. It was really kind of a synthesis of all of the different isms that are kind of packaged together and used on a superficial way. So when we look at Art Deco, we're actually starting to recognize some of the things that they were talking about with the isms. And the isms were talking about progress, they were talking about machines, they were talking about speed, they were talking about innovation and new ways of thinking. And so when artists and designers started to pick up and utilize this in this new style, they were playing with those notions of speed, of machines, of progressive and shapes, of very simplistic shapes. So all of those things that we saw in all of the isms are being applied here, but without the attitude of politics being involved in it. The other thing with the Art Deco style is that it wasn't just one thing. It wasn't just graphic design. It was furniture design. It was interior design. It was architecture. It was fashion. And it was in crafts and arts, decorative objects that you would have in your house. It was jewelry. Art Deco touched everything that people could touch. And so it wasn't just paintings, and it really wasn't paintings. That was very little of it was paintings. Most of it was objects, and so it became part of decorative arts at that time. So the other thing that was about this style was that it was very decadent, meaning that it was almost rich in the way that it looked. The people that were playing with Art Deco were actually celebrating what happened after World War I. We went from this time where everybody was depriving themselves as a result of shortages or using resources to pay for machinery and weapons and so on, to a time when money suddenly became available again and people had ability to spend. And so this period became one where there was a lot of free spending by all of those countries that had been the victors in the war. Germany was not one of those victors, and so they didn't really experience Art Deco the way that we did in the western portions, the other parts of the civilized world. But we definitely see elements of Art Deco being utilized. So what we notice in this, again, the idea of shapes, that this is the top of the Chrysler Building in New York City, and we can see that we have this idea of the arcs of circles that look like completed half circles. We have these ideas of the triangles that look like diamond shapes almost. And then the whole building itself is very shiny and glossy. We have a piece of furniture here where we've got wood, but it's been carved so that it's rounded corners, like it's streamlined, like it's in motion. And the surface of it is highly lacquered, very, very shiny, with a veneer finish, so that it's not even just a half-sawn piece of wood, it's the veneer, the best parts of the wood that have been applied, and all of this chrome that's all over it, and how the top half of this kind of hovers over the lower platform of it. This applied to typography, where a lot of typography was playing with this idea of shapes and utilizing shapes and the idea of motion and movement, or buildings that looked kind of steamliner-ish, if you will, or implied the idea of motion and movement and horizontal lines, or even T-sets, or very geometric, everything that's being done. Foot ornaments, very geometric in the way that they're being done. So there's a lot of people that get kind of confused about Art Deco to Art Nouveau, because you can sort of see how Art Nouveau kind of plays into this, into the organic forms, the figure, the form of the figure. There's a lot of animals and female forms that are in this. But if we look at this, we also notice that the forms are very geometric in the way that they're formed out. We don't have the idea of that whiplash kind of hair happening. Now we've got these nice, strong, angled lines that represent the wings on this figure. And on the car, the idea of this continuation of the lines, and everything's
Is that a pure
somewhat.
Carol?
I don't know.
Okay, no, so it's one of the cars that they were high.
But we can see, get the idea of this kind of streamlined sleekness that happens in the stuff that's being created. Everything's very geometric in form, or geometric in form, and just in the way that the fashion is designed. Buildings and so on that all have this kind of geometric quality to it that is reminiscent of this time. This was part of the 1920s, what we call the Roaring Twenties, and fashion and so on. But at the same time, we can still see qualities of Cubism at work. We can start to recognize elements of the flattening that was part of the style of sock pocket that's being incorporated, very flattened forms. But at the same time, we get the idea of the cubist elements or the futurist elements that are at work in them. So when we look at the traits of Art Deco, what we're recognizing that there was an advocation of progress in the machine, that there was this kind of streamlined appearance, and influenced by new technologies and transportation. We also have a little bit, in some cases, of Aztec and African art influencing the stuff that was being done. I didn't really show it too much here, but we had David Carter opening up the tomb of King Tut, and so that became really popular. We had the findings of Machu Picchu in Peru, and so that became kind of a theme for a lot of folks. But ultimately, polished metals, this idea of super technology being incorporated, and ultimately modeling it on the surface treatment of the isms without really promoting those root causes, and that's really important to understand in Art Deco. Cropping and composition also became important to advancing, kind of picking up on that object style technique that we had been seeing, so that approach to advertising was certainly incorporated. Again, I'll come back to it. So there are just a couple of people, actually, I think only one person, maybe two people that I want you guys to know that are associated with Art Deco. And the first one, his name is A.M. Cassandra. His real name was Adolphe Jean-Marie Morin. He was Ukrainian, but he changed his name to A.M. Cassandra and lived in Paris. And so all of his work, or most of his work, at least in the early part of his career, were from France. And he played with the idea of Cubism in the stuff that he was doing, but he also was doing them in an Art Deco fashion. So one of the things that we notice in Art Deco, especially in graphic approaches, is this idea of airbrushing. That became very popular, and for a lot of these guys, the airbrush effect was representative of the same idea of chrome or steel or movement. And so whenever they were using it, they were trying to say something about movement or motion or the surfaces. But at the same time, when we look at this particular poster, we recognize the cubist qualities in it. We can certainly see the idea of this large rectangle as making up the majority of the poster. But we also recognize that this poster is very thoughtful in the way that it's been conceived, because it is talking about a steamship. And we notice at the very base of this steamship is this little tugboat, which gives it scale. And so the idea of this steamship that appears to us as massive in comparison to that little tugboat in the foreground gives us a sense of solidity. We also know, if we know anything about physics or how the world works, gravity and so on, we know that when we see something above the water, that there's twice as much, if not more, below the surface. So by having this gradient effect that's going on, we as the viewers looking at this poster know that this much is above the ground, that there must be way much more below ground, below the surface level of water. And the reason why Cassandra did this was because he was trying to assure people that traveling by boat was safe.
This was after the Titanic?
Oh yeah, this is like 20 years after the
Okay,
Titanic.
alright.
But there is no other way to travel across the ocean at this point in history. Amelia Earhart didn't fly across the Atlantic Ocean until the 1920s. So they didn't have commercial airplanes yet at this point. People weren't using this as a method. So if you were going to go to Europe, you had to do it on a steamship. And the steamship industry suffered terribly after the sinking of the Titanic and the Lusitania that came in 1914. And there was a long period of time where the Americans were not traveling to Europe because they were afraid of getting onto a boat. So this was really an advertisement, a ploy to try to get people to understand it's safe. It's safe. Look at our steamship. It is so massive that you will feel safe in this massive entity that's traveling across the ocean. And Cassandra was smart like that. He understood how to motivate people and to use shapes as a method of trying to get across his idea. So here's one for a newspaper couple intransigeant. And we recognize that there is a figure there that's calling out. Does anybody know what this is, though? This part is. Recognize that? What is that?
Some type of like communication.
A telephone pole.
Yeah, it's like cables going into the ear of this person. That figure is actually Columbia, who represents freedom. So she's our Statue of Liberty, and in France she was a very famous character that showed up on a lot of statues. The Statue of Liberty was based upon Columbia and a lot of different statues that appeared in France. And so Columbia here is calling out for freedom, using the cable wires going into her ear to hear the news, and then piping it out in the form of l'entrance, which is the shortened version of the newspaper. L'Intransigeant is the name of the newspaper. And you can see that the way that he's done it, it looks like the masthead of the newspaper. But the hawkers, the kids out on the street, when they were selling the newspaper, instead of saying l'intransigeant, l'intransigeant, when they're selling the paper, they just say l'entrance, l'entrance, l'entrance. You can it saves a lot of time.
Is that Newsies, or is that?
That's Newsies,
Okay.
yeah. Those kids selling the newspapers out on the streets, they would go, l'entrance, l'entrance, and people would come around to buy their newspaper from l'entrance versus Depeche Mode or whatever the other names of the newspapers were that were selling side by side, so they could call it out faster. And so that this poster is kind of representing that idea of getting the news as fast as you can. Freedom is calling it out for the rest of the world. So that's pretty cool, the way that he did it. And Cassandra wasn't just done with that, but he actually developed this whole thing based upon a grid. So there was a structure underneath what he was doing. This is one of the few places where we actually see grids at work, but we're going to see more and more of it as we start to move along. So he was definitely thinking ahead of his time. And over again, he plays with this idea of utilizing these interesting kind of compositions where he's got a one-point perspective going on, where he's using that gradient airbrush effect. You'll notice that the typography at the type is playing off of the futurist qualities, simultaneity that's going on, and so he has a lot of different tools that he's playing with. And he certainly was playing with typography that was of this era, this Art Nouveau, or I'm sorry, Art Deco era. In fact, he created several fonts himself. One of them is called Peignot, so if you're ever looking for a font that is reminiscent of the Art Deco era, Peignot by Anne Cassandra is one of the better ones. And over again, we have examples, again, this positive negative that's happening, that's again reminiscent for us of the futurist style, and cropping, really tight cropping in the posters that he was doing. You always got the sense of what the poster was about, even if you didn't see the entire entity. He was very good at paring things down to their most simplistic forms and getting across the idea of what was happening. So I love this one because the record, you get the sense that the record is moving just from looking at how the word pathé is moving in successive quantities like that. And over again. Applying a lot of the elements, the effects of Gestalt happening here. So we have the background that's melting into the foreground. And then one more, this is that kind of futurist trait to it. Okay, so I lied, I said that he was the only one. Nope, there's one other I want you to know. His name was Edward McKnight Kauffer. And Edward McKnight Kauffer, the nice part about him was that he was an American, so at least we have that going for us. We have an American name here. Edward McKnight Kauffer had come from Kansas? No, Montana, sorry. Montana. He had been born in Montana and was coming of age right when the Armory Show was traveling around the United States, and had been in Chicago when it made its way there. He was intrigued with the show. He thought it was great. He really fell in love with the idea of futurism, with Cubism, these new progressive ideas of European art. But he was going to art school in Chicago at the time. He asked some of his professors what they thought of the show, and he was hoping that they would say something good about it, but instead they were just like everybody else and said nasty things about this Armory Show. And so, in disgust, he decided, well, he wanted more of this, and he wasn't getting it in the United States, and he was seeing Norman Rockwell and how popular that style was really picking up to be, so he decided, I'm going to go to Europe. I'm going to go see it in person, this new kind of art, all this new stuff that's happening in Europe. I want to see it in person. And so that's what he did. He traveled to Europe. He started traveling from place to place to place. He traveled to Germany, saw object style posters. He traveled to the Netherlands, saw the style. He saw futurism and all these styles all over the place in Europe, and was really excited about it. But World War I broke out. And fortunately for him, he was in London at the time, but he knew that he was taking his life in his own hands if he decided to travel across the ocean. All of the ocean liners at that time said, traveling, it's a risk. It's a risk, so stay put. So he decided to stay put, and he became an expat in Great Britain for a long number of years. So in 1918, he got a job working for, doing designs. He ended up designing this poster for the Daily Herald, a newspaper, and he did it in a very futurist style, but not utilizing the ideas of futurism. This is about birds in flight and the idea of soaring to success, and the newspaper and how that will help people soar to success. And he capitalized on this idea of futurism, especially in the stuff that he was doing. So we can see this idea of the metaphorical use, we see the simultaneity that happens in the posters. Did an awful lot of advertisements for the London Underground. And so we see that at play. I lied. I had shown you guys some work from Fortunato de Pero the last time that we met. Fortunato de Pero was another one that was using Art Deco as a style. Now, ultimately, Fortunato de Pero, if you recall, he was one of the people that was associated with futurism. He was really gung-ho about futurism, but he also recognized that people didn't necessarily embrace the idea of futurism because of that fascist thing. And so he tried to soften it for a lot of people. And so he chose to do advertisements in a futurist method. He ended up coming to the United States in the 1920s. Again, he's an Italian, but he came to the United States in the 1920s as part of a World's Fair Expo and stayed for a couple of years. And he ended up doing work for a bunch of different companies. This one was in New York City. It's a hat company. So you can sort of see that hat at the top. It's called cloche, that kind of hat. And then he did he did cover design for Vogue magazine a couple of times over. So here's another one. He did advertisements for Metropolis, or the movie Metropolis, and so, oh, sorry, that's Edward Crawford, forgive me. But you can see that the style of Art Deco is playing into it. I think that's it as far as what I have for, yeah, here's the other famous Metropolis poster for this movie. It's kind of done in a futurist style. In any case, all of these are falling into the camp of Art Deco. Any questions? I'm going to stop here. We'll pick up on the Bauhaus next Wednesday. Anybody need me to go backwards?